The US-China trade war redrew the global agricultural map, with soybeans at the center of the storm. For years, American farmers depended on China, which bought over half of all US soybean exports, a $24.5 billion market. But when the US imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, China retaliated by slashing its US soybean purchases. The result, US soybean exports to China dropped by more than 50% in a year, and prices crashed by 40%. Family farms across the Midwest faced bankruptcy as unsold crops piled up and costs soared. The crisis deepened when President Trump escalated tariffs to 100% on Chinese imports, while the US Treasury controversially funded Argentina, a direct competitor. China hit back with its own tariffs and began leveraging its control over rare earth minerals, intensifying the global trade chaos. The domino effect was clear. American agriculture was shaken, and the world's food supply chains were thrown into turmoil. The soybean war was no longer just about crops. It was about economic power and political leverage. As the dust settled, the world's biggest agricultural relationship had fractured, with consequences rippling far beyond US borders. The stage was set for a new era in global trade. With the US sidelined, China turned to South America, especially Brazil and Argentina, to feed its soybean demand. South American producers ramped up exports, aided by Argentina's suspension of export taxes, and China quickly became their top customer. Massive shipments flowed from South American ports to China, reshaping global trade routes and leaving the US behind. Europe, a major soybean importer, suddenly found itself competing with China for limited South American supplies. Prices soared, and European buyers struggled to secure enough soybeans for animal feed and food production. The result, higher costs for farmers, rising grocery bills, and growing anxiety about food security across the continent. Europe's reliance on global markets had become a vulnerability. Policymakers now faced urgent questions about how to protect their food system in a world where supply could be cut off overnight. The global soybean war had forced Europe into a new era of competition and uncertainty. The soybean shock pushed Europe to rethink its dependence on imports. Governments began incentivizing farmers to grow more protein-rich crops like peas, fava beans, and lupins, alternatives to soybeans. The goal: build a resilient, self-sufficient food system less exposed to global trade disputes. Transitioning isn't easy. Farmers need new skills, infrastructure, and support, and costs are likely to rise in the short term. But the long-term vision is clear: a stable, sustainable European agriculture less vulnerable to foreign shocks. These new crops also offer environmental benefits, enriching soil and reducing fertilizer use. The US-China trade war, while painful, may ultimately accelerate Europe's move toward food independence. Europe's fields and its future are being reshaped by global conflict. The trade war's ripple effects reached even used cooking oil, now a prized ingredient for green fuels. As US imports of Chinese used cooking oil soared, American soybean farmers protested, fearing competition for biodiesel markets. The US responded with steep tariffs and tax exclusions, slashing Chinese UCO imports by 43% in just months. China, left with a surplus, turned to Europe, which needs UCO to meet its own green energy targets. But Europe faces a dilemma. Cheap Chinese UCO could help decarbonize transport, but might also threaten local biofuel producers. The EU has already investigated Chinese biofuels for dumping, wary of market disruption. Europe must now balance its climate ambitions with protecting domestic industries. Even waste oil has become a flashpoint in the global trade war. The US-China Soybean War forced Europe to confront its reliance on global supply chains for food and energy. The crisis sparked a push for agricultural self-sufficiency, with more protein crops and a focus on resilient local food systems. The same pressures are shaping Europe's energy transition, as the continent weighs the benefits and risks of importing Chinese UCO for biofuels. The challenge: balance sustainability, security, and economic interests in a more fragmented world. Europe's response will define its future, investing in innovation, supporting farmers, and building a circular economy. The era of easy global trade is over. Resilience is now the priority. The soybean war's legacy is a more self-reliant, adaptable Europe. From a single crop, a new vision for the continent is taking root.